Hello, my name is Saber, and every time a new set comes out, I like to prepare myself for the pre-release by going over a specific subset of cards in the new set coming out, specifically the instants, spells with flash, and mass removal spells in the set, because I feel like those are the cards that, if you don't know what they are in the set, like what variations are in the set, what their casting costs are, what exactly they can do. Those are the cards that you lose to the most when the set is new, that you don't lose to later on in the set once you've gotten used to them, once you remember the cards and what your opponents can do at certain mana costs. So, to prepare myself for every pre release, I like to go over those specific subsets of cards, and it helps me a lot in the middle of games when I can know what my opponents can do. So I'm hoping it helps other people. These are some of my most watched videos on my channel. So, with the exception of the Final Fantasy one, because I botched the details for it when I set it to be live, and I did not realize it until hours later. And apparently that just kind of killed it for the algorithm. But details aside, so we're going to do this all in one take, so I apologize for any inconsistencies or anything, or if I suddenly go into a horrible coughing fit or anything like that, because I only have enough time to do one take and not a whole lot of time to edit it. So we want this to go live as soon as possible, because other people with their own guides will be releasing stuff very shortly, and this, I feel like, is a separate thing. Like, a lot of people will be doing, like, well, here's the entire set, and I'm going to give them a letter grade or a number grade or something. It's like, no, I'm not good enough at Magic to evaluate in a vacuum how good certain cards are going to be. But knowing these cards, even if you don't know how good they're going to be, a lot of people are going to be trying out new stuff because it's a new set. They're going to be seeing if these cards actually do something, or they're going to get weak pools and they're going to have to try things that they wouldn't otherwise play at the pre-release. So, knowing what these cards are, I think gives you the best chance of winning games you would otherwise lose. So I think it at least gives a different angle on the new set than a lot of people are doing. So I hope this helps you. If it does, please let me know in the comments. I would appreciate it. So I'm going to pull up my list, because it's a lot easier to remember all of these new cards if I make a list for myself. So we're starting with white. So the very first card is Beyond the Quiet. So this is White's Wrath for the set. It is 2 white and 3, so it's a 5 mana Wrath. Exile all creatures and spacecraft. Okay, let me preface this with, a lot of my advice is going to be just know this card exists, because that is half the battle. If you are aware of this card, what its mana cost is, and what it can actually do, then you're already most of the way there. Playing around certain things, which we'll get into in specific cards, is a thing that I will go over when I can, but most of it's going to boil down to, if you know this card exists, you're not going to get caught by it. That is especially true for the Wraths. So, Wraths can take anywhere from, for a true Wrath, usually they don't go below 4 mana unless they've got something really weird tacked onto them. Most of the time anymore they are 5 plus mana, so Beyond the Quiet falls into that category. Notably, this one also kills the Spacecraft card type, which is a subtype of artifact in this set. So spacecrafts don't start off as creatures. They're closer to vehicles at that point, but not quite. They all have a station cost, which requires you to tap creatures with power greater than 0, because every creature that you tap, you put counters onto the station equal to its power, but you have to tap the creature specifically for this effect, and you have to do it at sorcery speed. So, let's see if we have one of them nearby that I can show you what it looks like. Here we go. The Lumen class frigate. So it starts off as just the artifact. Once you have stationed it with 2 total power worth of creatures, it gains this ability. Once you've stationed it with 12 total power worth of creatures, it becomes an artifact creature spacecraft and gains these abilities. So they're kind of like vehicles, except that once you've tapped enough power, they just stay creatures. And you can build up over time instead of having to do it all in one turn. So Beyond the Quiet kills all of the creatures and all of the vehicles in this set, all of the spacecraft in this set. So it's going to hit everything that is or potentially can be a creature. And it exiles also. There is a modest amount of recursion in this set, like a little bit more than normal. So the fact that it exiles all of them is relevant for the set. The way you play around Wraths, if you don't know, is you don't overcommit when you don't have to. Which means that if your opponent is already incredibly far behind on board, piling on more creatures when their only out is a Wrath, like, if you have 3 different creatures that are lethal and your opponent has no creatures in play, you don't need to play a 4th lethal creature. Your opponent needs to come up with 3 separate creatures and or removal spells on their turn in order to live. Not to get ahead, not to win the game, just to live. So, if you put a 4th creature into play, and they kill all 4 of your creatures, and you don't have another one now instead of having a follow-up threat that could potentially win the game, you're left with nothing. So, not overcommitting to the board is the most important thing when you're playing around a Wrath. It gets a lot more complicated when there are more moving pieces. Like, let's say only one of your creatures is innately lethal, so any removal spell on that one would save them. But if you put a few more creatures onto the board, maybe they don't have good blocks. This is one of those things where you have to kind of feel out the situation, and the more you play Magic, the more you will understand the nuances of this one. But a lot of the times, if the opponent is going to lose the game just to what you have, you shouldn't overcommit if they're in the colors of a Wrath that will allow them to win the game because they killed all of your things with 1 card. One of the most obvious things that people will do is pass a turn, like pass turn 5, without putting anything down and without really having a board presence, while having access to 5 mana. That one's a major alarm bell that newer players miss. That is the opponent going, well, my life total's relatively high, maybe I can get them to put 1 more creature onto the battlefield if I pass this turn, because it looks like I'm vulnerable. Maybe they'll start piling things on to try and go for the kill, and then I can get all of their stuff with Beyond the Quiet. So that is the White Wrath for the set, but there are a couple other Wrath variants in the set, so usually there's only like 1 or 2. This set has a few different things that are killing all the stuff. Next up is Dual Sun Technique. So this is our first instant. So target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. If it has a +1/+1 counter on it, draw a card. This is 1 and a white. So this one's actually kind of low on the tier list of combat tricks. Double strike is an incredibly powerful trick, and it can win you games, but if you don't have giant bodies or a whole lot of pump effects, this one is not going to win you the most combats or the most games, because it doesn't actually add any power to the creature itself. So you can expect Dual Sun Technique like middle to later of the format to show up primarily in like white-green decks, or any other deck that can produce a lot of high power creatures for relatively low mana. Like there is a black rare that has 4 power and menace because it has a drawback attached to it. It's like 4 power, menace, and ward, discard a card. But it also puts counters on your opponent's creatures when it attacks, so it is one of those things where it's not a very good card unless it kills the opponent very quickly, and a card like Dual Sun Technique will allow it to deal a lot more damage very quickly, so. But most of the time, this thing is just going to be like, okay, you blocked with your 2/2, I'm going to give my guy double strike so that way he lives and kills your guy. Or you blocked with your 4/4, I'm going to give my guy double strike so that way I trade for your much larger body and 2-for-1 myself. That's not a great trick, but you do have to be aware that it exists, especially if your opponent has high power creatures and or trampling creatures, because that will allow them to do a ton of damage out of nowhere with Dual Sun technique, which is why it's an uncommon. That is the part where it gets scary, is if your opponent has a large trampling creature, it's very hard to block that effectively in a way that you don't die once your life total starts getting within range, but also where you keep a board state that can let you keep playing the game. You know, like, yes, you could block with everything and just lose all of your guys to this suddenly double strike trampling creature and still be alive, but that doesn't do you much good if there's a 7/7 trampler on the board and you're at 4 and you have no board state. So next up is Emergency Eject. So it's white and 2 for an instant, destroy target non-land permanent, and its controller makes a lander token. So lander is a new subtype artifact token similar to clues, food, like it has defined traits, and it's just called the lander token. In this case, it is a Wayfarer's Bauble. It is 2 tap, sacrifice this artifact, search your library for a basic land, and put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. So you are killing their creature, presumably, possibly one of their other problematic permanents, and giving them an artifact token that will then allow itself to be turned into a land later on. So, notably, there is a mechanic in this set called Void. Let's see if I can find one of the Void cards real quick. A lot of them are in black, so we'll just pop down there. So Void happens if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn, or a card was warped this turn, and then it has an effect. So if you give them a lander token, you are setting them up to trigger Void, and Void can do anything. It's an ability word, so it always triggers from the same thing, but what it actually does will vary from card to card, so it could be anything minor like opponent loses a life and you gain a life, all the way up to opponent exiles a creature at end of turn. And anything in between. So you are giving them a very real thing when you give them this lander token. It's not as potent as giving them like a 1/1 creature like Stroke of Midnight would be. So I do like this card a lot as a removal spell, but it does actually have synergies in the set for the opponent. There are also a bunch of cards that care if an artifact entered the battlefield, or if you control more artifacts, the card gets better. So just keep that in mind, that it is giving them something, and then when they don't need that something anymore, they can cash it in to thin their deck out of a land and make their draws a tiny bit better for the rest of the game. So it's not nothing to give them the lander token, but it's a lot less than like Stroke of Midnight giving them a 1/1 creature token, for example. Alright, next up is Focus Fire, which I believe leads into the whole artifacts matter. Focus Fire deals X damage to target attacking or blocking creature, where X is 2 plus the number of creatures. Oh no, this one only cares about spacecraft specifically, and the landers are not spacecraft. Alright, there are a few cards that do care about the number of artifacts you control. I thought this was one of them. It is not. It only cares about spacecraft. So it cares about creatures and the things that can become creatures. So, notably, this is only 1 white mana. We just had a card in the last set. This is another one of those things that they do in a lot of sets where it's like, it deals damage to them based on the number of creatures you control, or to target attacking or blocking creature based on the number of creatures plus, equipment. Like Slash of Light was creatures plus equipment and didn't care if it was attacking for 2 mana. This is 1 mana, but it has to be attacking or blocking in order for you to kill it. The effectiveness of this one, it's always 2 damage, so that's already kind of playable and limited, being able to kill a 1 or 2 toughness creature for 1 mana without anything else in play means that you don't get run over very quickly in the early game. It is a reasonable piece of interaction, but it also scales over the course of the game, potentially dealing 3 or 4 points of damage later on, and on a stalled board state, 6 to 10 if things get really bogged down. So that's a lot of efficiency because it's only a 1 mana trick. So the way you play around cards that care about your creatures attacking or blocking is, because this one is scalable, you'll know if your creature is vulnerable to it, and then you can attack either with things that are not currently vulnerable to it, or with things that you don't mind losing to encourage them to have to use their card, or just take lots of damage. Like, if you have a 3/3 and your opponent has out a 2/2, you don't really want to lose your 3/3 to a 1 mana trick, but if you have a 3/3 and like 3 2/2s in play and you just attack with all the 2/2s, now they have the option of killing one of them with the spell and trading off for another, and then not having any creatures in play. And being down the trick, they have the option of trading off their guy for one of your 2/2s and having to find another creature in order to threaten the 3/3. Like, none of those options are great for them, because now they're not getting to use their removal spell on your best creature, and they're either forced to use it on a worse creature just to stay alive, or have it get worse for the next turn. So that is the way you play around cards like this, is you don't put your best creature into range for it. Also keep in mind, in this scenario, they could still kill a 4/4 if they really needed to, because they could block with their 2/2 and focus fire before damage is dealt, and it would deal the 3 damage to your guy. So technically it kills up to a 5/5 at that point. So just be aware of that. Like, don't put your best guy in range for this thing. Like, you, in that scenario, if you had a 6/6, for example, you could comfortably attack into focus fire, and it would have to be something else in order for them to actually win combat, or at least kill your giant creature. But yeah, if you can keep this card in mind and do the math, you'll know what they can kill and what they can't kill, and what you can put in danger of being shot down by this thing, and still have a reasonable chance of winning. Next up is Pinnacle Star Cage, which is not quite a Wrath, but it is super relevant to that category. So this is Temporary Lockdown as an artifact. When this artifact enters, exile all artifacts and creatures with mana value 2 or less until this artifact leaves the battlefield. It also has the activate ability 6 and 2 white, and you put all of the exile cards into their owner's graveyards and create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token for each card put into the graveyard this way. Then you sacrifice the Star Cage. You sacrifice it after doing all of that, because when the Star Cage leaves the battlefield, it returns everything that it exiled to the battlefield. It is one of those type of effects. So this one you play around by not overcommitting small things. If you're not worried, for whatever reason, about Beyond the Quiet, then you only have to worry that you're overcommitting little guys. The most obvious way that this is happening is if your opponent is playing nothing but larger things that wouldn't get swept away by this. So that's kind of hard to tell, because as the game goes on, nobody wants to play like a bunch of little things. So if you don't know what's in their hand, you don't know they're intentionally not playing their little guys out, and that they're trying to set up for killing all of the little things and leaving themselves with all their big guys in play. But yeah, you just don't run out too many little things into a card like this if you can help it. The biggest downside to this one is that it's cheap. So if you go like 1-drop, 2-drop, and then a second 2-drop because you don't have a 3, it's kind of hard to have not played into this thing. But you can't really help that, because that's how your draw lined up. And then your opponent gets to eat like 3 of your things with their 1 card until it leaves the battlefield. Yeah, this one's a lot harder to play around in the early game. In the later game, if you're worried about this one specifically, you just have to not play out smaller things into it. It's kind of like Xenos from the last set, where if you're already winning against black, you don't run out like a whole bunch of X2s to see if you can close the game out, because then all of your guys just randomly die to this one rare creature. Next up is Radiant Strike. This is another one that shows up in a lot of sets. This one has the variant to be able to destroy an artifact straight up, but can also destroy a tapped creature, and you gain 3 life. So, white and 3, destroy target artifact or tapped creature, gain 3 life. We get a variant on this card every single set, where it either kills an attacking or blocking creature, or it kills a tapped creature, and the extra mana trades off for some benefit, in this case life gain. So the fact that this can destroy an artifact, and there are a lot of artifacts in this set, as befits a sci-fi setting, so this one you're going to see fairly often. This is going to be very main deckable in this format. It can only kill tapped creatures, but there are a couple of effects that will tap a creature for a turn, like spend mana, tap this creature, tap target creature. There's at least one of those in white. Blue has at least one of its tap target creature and put a stun counter on it effects in the set. So there will be ways to kill the creature that you want to, even if your opponent isn't attacking with it. So you're going to see this one a lot. Again, the way that you play around this thing is that if you think that this is the problem, you attack with your other creatures that don't have vigilance. So that way they have to kill a worse creature than the one they wanted to kill whenever possible. The biggest thing is that if they're leaving up mana, if their board is underdeveloped and they're leaving up mana, that means they either don't have anything at all, or they're trying to kill your best guy with Radiant Strike or a similar card. So, and this one is a lot harder. Like the one that's 1 white mana, like all you need is a board state to kill anything, is a lot harder to play around than something like this. Because if the opponent has nothing, then you can figure out, do I need to attack with my other guy in order to kill them this much faster? Like, if they had Radiant Strike and they killed my best guy and negated 3 points of damage from my other attacking creatures, how bad is this for me versus how bad is it for me if I don't attack with my best guy and they have nothing? A lot of the time, you can play around Radiant Strike by forcing them to kill your second best creature and then have to top deck something because now they don't have a removal spell for your best creature and they spent an entire turn. Even better is if they really desperately don't want to kill your smaller guys and they just waste the mana. One of the biggest things about holding up instants like this, especially counter spells that we'll get into later, is the idea of not spending all of your mana every turn to develop out to the board or to interact with what your opponent is doing or advance your game plan to a winning board state is devastating in the long run. It takes a lot of time and a lot of efficiency later on to recover from taking an entire turn off once you hit like 4+ mana. So making them waste their mana with Radiant Strike because they can't afford to kill like your 1/1s and 2/2s attacking because they need to save it for your like big old 6/6 monster that you've put into play is one of the better things that you can do if you can get into that position and they are leaving mana open. Especially if they had anything else to do with their mana, but were like, well, I'm too far behind, I have to kill the 6/6, and then you just don't attack with it, and now you stranded 4 of their mana and the card in their hand. That is one of the most brutal things you can do in a game of Limited, is to make your opponent waste this much mana, or to waste their like premium removal spell on something way worse than your best creature. So that is the way that you play around cards like this. Next up is Reroute Systems. So this one is incredibly versatile. It gives a creature or artifact indestructible until end of turn, or it deals 2 damage to target tapped creature. So very similar to the other one for 1 mana, where it deals 2 plus the number of creatures and vehicles you have, or creatures and spacecraft you have. This one can only ever deal 2 damage, and it has to be to a tapped creature, so presumably one that attacked. But it also can give one of your creatures indestructible or one of your artifacts until end of turn. These things have been showing up in every single set. There's usually like one indestructible, one hexproof, and maybe one other one. And they're all 1 mana spells that blank removal very effectively, or combat tricks, where you were going to lose your guy, and the opponent was going to have a much better board position afterwards, and then for 1 mana you counter their effect that was going to kill your guy, get to keep it, and now their attacks are bad because of indestructible or because of the hexproof, and the creature is now still in play to block. So, you know, you've seen this one before with like Snakeskin Veil or like Restoration Magic in the last set, where it's just 1 mana and it saves their guy, and now you're out your best removal spell and they still have their thing on board. But this one has the fail case of also being able to just deal 2 damage to a tapped creature. So it can kill a smaller attacking creature or powerful utility creature that used its ability, like if it tapped to do its ability, or it can help finish off a larger creature if that's what you desperately need. And having that kind of versatility on a 1 mana trick is kind of brutal, honestly. Like, most of the time these things are fine just as 1 mana save your guy from your opponent's, like, 4 mana removal spell. Because it's not that hard in a lot of cases to wait the 1 extra turn, deploy your game-breaking threat with 1 mana left over, and actually be able to protect it. So, of note, and I've been seeing a lot of other players do this lately, if your opponent is tapped out, just remember that your instant speed removal spells that don't require the creature to be in the middle of combat can just kill an opponent's creature. You don't have to wait until the absolute last second. For the longest time, it was almost always correct to wait until the last possible second to kill your opponent's creature with an instant speed removal spell, because they might do something to enhance a creature, and then you'll get that 2-for-1 value. In modern Magic, it's becoming a tiny bit better with each set, it feels like, to just kill the thing while they're tapped out, if they're ever tapped out. Because there are a bunch of 1 and 2 mana tricks floating around in every single set that will save a creature from removal, and if it's more important that the creature dies for you to win than it is that you get that 2-for-1 in order to win, you should probably just kill the creature. Like, I have cast more overkills and Sephiroth's interventions on my own turn than I ever would have cast, like, you know, murders back in the day on creatures and Doomblades. You know, you were supposed to wait, but as each set keeps adding in, like, a handful of cheap interaction that will save a creature specifically from a removal spell, killing their guy while they're tapped out has become more and more of a thing, and it doesn't matter that you could have cast a spell at instant speed and maybe gotten them to use a combat trick on their guy also and gotten that sweet 2-for-1 value. It becomes more important sometimes that you just kill the creature. So don't forget that. It's been ingrained in a lot of Magic players' heads over the years that you save your instants until the last possible second to cast them, just to give your opponent more time to do something that makes your instant better. Nowadays, it's not always correct, but sometimes if the creature is really that dire of a threat, you just want to kill it while it's vulnerable. You don't want to give them the chance to untap with a way to protect it. So keep that in mind. That's been a thing that's been coming up more and more. Like I said, every set now has like 2 to 3 of these, and they're usually at like the 1 mana slot, because the 2 mana ones don't work out anywhere near as often. It's a lot harder to get to 8 mana to protect your 6-drop than it is to get to 7 mana to protect your 6-drop. And, you know, with how bomby some things are in newer sets, just being able to get 1 mana ahead of its casting cost to be able to protect it is a much bigger benefit than having to get 2 mana ahead of its casting cost. Alright, so that was Reroute Systems. Next up is Squire's Lightblade. Speaking of cards that are very similar to the previous set, so this one is very similar to Coral Sword from Final Fantasy. It is a 1 white for a flash equipment. When it enters, you may attach it to target creature you control, and that creature gains first strike until end of turn. And naturally, it just gives the equipped creature +1/+0, and it equips for 3. So this is one where you're going to run into it from time to time, but I don't think it's actually that good of a card. It is way better as a trick than it is as an equipment, but there are, like I said, a lot of cards that care about artifacts in this set. Both having enough of them or having one enter the battlefield, that there is a chance you'll run into players playing this just to have more triggers for their cares about artifacts, or just to have enough critical massive artifacts. And it's fine as a combat trick. It's not great. It is a 1 mana trick, though, and it does win combat a lot of the time. So if you need to play around this card, you need to have your creature overpower theirs by at least 1. So that way, in this case, you need to have, like, 2 more toughness than its power, so that way this doesn't kill them by itself. The problem with that is that we've already seen a couple different cards that will deal 2+ damage to a creature, so you might be losing out to one of those instead. Which is always healthy for an environment where there's like a bunch of different tricks and they land at different spots. So that way you have to try and figure out which one it is, or play around all of them. And playing around all of them means figuring out what the worst one is, and if you can play around that one, and if you can't, then it's like, well, if I need to play around everything, and I can't play around that one by getting into combat, then I just don't get into combat. You know, you take the damage if you can, or you chump block if you can't, and move on, and you don't put your important guys in range of any of the other things. But yeah, this one is going to get me, because one of my things is always trying to force out combat tricks early. So one of the things about combat tricks and like small amounts of damage and whatnot is, in the later parts of the game, anything that can kill your dire threats, if you can get them to use those cards earlier on less important things, you're going to win those games when you finally play your big thing and they don't have anything for it. It's a lot like baiting out removal, but if you do it early enough, it looks good to the opponent. One of the things that I will almost always do, if I think it's like a cheap trick that would win combat in the later parts of the game, is to block early with the idea that I don't care if you use your trick to kill my 2/2. You know, I'll block your 2/2 with my 2/2, and if you want to use your 1 mana, give a creature a +2/+2, and do something else trick here, that is way better for me than you using it to save, like, your 5/5 later on when I put my 2 3/3s in front of it. So I like to bait out tricks early, and cards that leave behind bonuses are the ones that hurt me the most because of that strategy. Fortunately, this one only increases power and not toughness, so it's not as big a deal, and it doesn't further enhance the creature. Like, the first strike is only the turn that it enters, so you don't have to worry about, like, okay, then they're going to move the equipment over to another creature and now it's +1 power in first strike. It's like, no, that's not what this card does. It's just a huge mana investment for 1 extra power. So it's not that bad in that regard, but it is one of those things that I'm going to get got a little bit by because of how I try and force out combat tricks early. And I do recommend that for the most part. If you don't know you're specifically playing around a combat trick that permanently enhances the creature, then it's usually best to bait your opponent into using that card early. Because it's always going to be able to save something in combat down the line, or from a damage-based removal spell, or something similar. So if you can get them to use it early, on creatures that don't really matter, you're going to be feeling very good when your opponent is at the end game and they can't kill your guy without double or triple blocking it, and they have to lose like their entire board in order to shut down your guy instead of being able to save one of their creatures and possibly just take it down with the one creature and the combat trick instead of having to sacrifice like 2 or 3 creatures to it. Alright, that was Squire's Lightblade. Last one for white is Zealous Display. So, white and 2, creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. If it's not your turn, untap those creatures. This is another effect that we see a lot in Magic, and we see a lot of variance on it, and the way you play around it depends on what the actual stat boost is. In this case, the fact that it does not give toughness is very, very important. A lot of times this effect will give +2/+1 and we'll call or +1/+1 or something, and depending on how big the buff is, it will change the mana costs on it. So to play around this one, first you figure out if you will die to unblock creatures. Like if your opponent casts this spell and their 3/1/1s are all getting through and you're taking 9 damage from them and you're at 8, like you can't let 3 creatures get through then, so you have to block in such a way that no more than like, you know, so that way you're only taking like 6 damage at most or 7 damage at most in this scenario from their unblocked creatures. It's kind of hard to deal 7 because you need like one larger thing or like a 0 power creature, but you get the idea. First you block so that you don't die, but then when figuring out the blocks, you want to not line up things so that this one specifically ruins you. And because a lot of the other things are like 2 damage or 2 damage plus, or +1 power to your guy, you're actually playing around a bunch of them by playing around this one when they go all in for their attack. So because you don't have to worry about toughness, what you want to do is you put your biggest creatures on the best creature that they can kill without dying to the bonus. So if you have a 5/5, you don't block their 3/3 with it, you block their 2/2 with it, for example, if you can afford to do this. Like, you put your 2/2s on their 2/2s and their 3/1s and whatnot, and if you don't have a good lineup, sometimes you're going to put, like, your chump blocker on their guy that would kill your biggest guy if it suddenly had +2 power, so that way your big guy doesn't die in the middle of combat, and you're still not taking lethal damage. But that's basically how you do, because you don't have to worry about toughness. If you have to worry about toughness, then you have to make sure that you're lining up your blocks such that it's not like 2/2 on 2/2 as much as you can help things like that. So that way when they cast their spell, their things don't live through combat. This one isn't helping them live through combat, so you get to assign blockers based on just knowing that if they suddenly had +2 power, you're not going to lose your best creatures if you can help it. Like I said, first you figure out if you're going to die, and if you're going to die, you assign blockers in a way that you don't die to this thing instead. Then you figure out which creatures can go on which ones to maximize your things not dying and their things still dying. The biggest thing about this card, though, is that it really screws up combat math when you're attacking. So you do have to keep this one in mind. If they have a bunch of, like, tapped creatures, like small evasive creatures that they got through for damage, where this wouldn't have been lethal anyway, and it's like, okay, well, I'm taking too much damage, I'm going to need to try and kill them this turn. Be aware that this thing might happen, and all of a sudden, not only are their guys able to trade for your guys where they weren't before, but the ones that were attacking are also now back to block. So you might wind up losing more of your creatures than you thought you were going to, and not killing the opponent because they have more blockers. So just be aware of that one. Like, this one can swing a race where it untaps all of their creatures to block, where you thought you were trading blows back and forth and that nobody was blocking. So just be aware of that mode on the card, because it does do that also. Alright, that brings us to blue. Our first blue spell is Annul. Annul is a reprint. It's 1 blue, it counters target artifact or enchantment spell. So there's a whole lot of strategy in playing around counterspells with the idea that you want your opponent to waste their mana. This one only costs 1 mana. It is very hard to make them feel like they've wasted their mana, because it is possible, like on turn 4, to deploy a 3-drop and still have Annul available to counter anything really scary. So the other way that you play around counterspells is to bait them. So if you can, run out your less dangerous artifacts and enchantments first and save the better ones. If your opponent is constantly holding up a blue, there aren't a whole bunch of instant speed tricks in this set that only cost a single blue mana. So Annul is one of the primary ones. There's also one that can cost 1. I forget what the exact conditions are. We'll see it later. But it has the ability to tap an artifact or creature and draw a card. So depending on when that one costs 1, might be an indicator of if they have that potentially and not Annul. But yeah, Annul is very difficult to play around with the wasted mana aspect of it. So what you need to do is play around it by baiting them as much as possible, forcing them to keep deciding to counter like your next best threat each time, until you either have to go for it because you have nothing left and you need to just hope they don't have Annul, or you finally get them to use it and then you can deploy your scariest thing either also on that turn or on a subsequent turn, now that they've had to spend their counter spell on something that they didn't really want to if they had known, but kind of had to because the other thing was also kind of problematic. Next up is Cerebral Download. So there are a handful of card draw spells in this set at instant speed. So the 2 things you need to know for card draw at instant speed is, 1, it might be the thing that's giving them priority. The other thing is the idea of making them waste their mana is a big thing with counterspells, especially counterspells that cost like 3+ mana. So your opponent can't just leave up their mana every single turn for a counterspell unless they are winning by a lot on board. Like, they need to have a very strong board position, and then they can leave up counterspells forever because it's on you to do something, and eventually you'll cast something that they need to counter, and now they're good. They've gotten their counterspell, and you've lost your, like, key removal spell, or large creature that would stabilize the board, whatever it is, your Wrath effect. They got rid of it, and now they're good to go with whatever else they want to spend their mana on, but meanwhile, you're still behind on board, and you just spent your whole turn and did nothing. So they can sit on counterspells like that when they're ahead. When they're behind, though, it completely flips in your favor, because now, if they don't spend the mana on the counterspell, then they have to be able to do something else, or they are just falling further and further behind every single turn. So even spells that draw cards at that point are something else to do with their mana if you don't play into the counterspell, and it can find them more action, so that way they can interact with the board. So you do have to be aware of the instant speed card draw spells, even though there's nothing to actually play around, just because it gives them another option when they don't get to spend their mana on counterspells. And we'll see a few counterspells in this set besides Annul as we keep going. As far as what it does, it's Surveil X, where X is a number of artifacts you control, then draw 3 cards. So, again, an effect that scales based on the number of artifacts you control. There are a lot of effects like that in this set because there are so many artifacts. So, our next one is Consult the Star Charts, which is also a card draw spell. Oops, went past it. There it is. Consult the Star Charts. This one is blue and 1 and kicks for blue and 1. So you look at the top X cards, where X is a number of lands you control. You put one of those cards into your hand. If the spell was kicked, you get a second one into your hand, and the rest go to the bottom of your library in a random order. So again, it's just a card draw spell, but it does give them something to do with their mana to try and find stuff if you play around their counter spells. Next up is Desculpting Blast. So this is a bounce spell. Blue and 1, return target non-land card. Yeah, target non-land permanent to owner's hand. If it returns an attacking permanent, so creature, to its owner's hand, you get a 1/1 colorless drone artifact creature token that has flying, and this token can block only creatures with flying. There are multiple cards in the set that make these drones. They all have that built into them. They cannot block non-flying creatures. So it is worth noting that your flyers are slightly more vulnerable to being blocked by this thing. So if you're counting on winning the race by damaging them in the air while having blockers on the ground, or by ignoring their creatures on the ground, this one will not only let them send one of your flyers back to your hand, it will also create a chump blocker, or possibly even a thing that trades if your other flyer is small enough, for your other flyer in the same thing. So if you're trying to win the race in the air, be aware of that, especially that one of your guys might wander off and one of your other guys might get blocked by a 1/1 that wasn't there before. Past that, it's a bounce spell, and if you can get them to have to bounce the thing when it's not attacking, obviously that's slightly more ideal because it stops them from getting the 1/1 flyer. But depending on the situation, it might just be in your best interest to let them make the 1/1 flyer, so that way you can redeploy after combat. Also, for newer players, if you don't have to play something pre-combat in order to apply a buff to your guys, in any way, shape, or form, don't play your thing pre-combat. Leave your mana available so that the opponent doesn't know you're going to be tapped out. Because if they Desculpting Blast your medium-sized creature, and replaying that would be better than any of the other cards in your hand this turn, now you still have the mana. Yeah, this is one of those things that comes up a lot with players that are less experienced at Magic, is they want to cast their spells basically so they don't forget. Or to show the opponent that there isn't anything if they're trying to, like, for more advanced players, it's like, okay, I kind of want you to feel safe blocking my 2/2 with your 2/2, so I'm going to tap out ahead of time, so that way you know the other thing is coming, and now you either have to block with your 2/2 to trade off with my guy, or save your 2/2 for part of a gang block later. But for the most part, don't play your things pre-combat if they're not going to add to the combat step. Like, if there's a thing that cares about the number of artifacts you have for its power, playing an artifact pre-combat means it deals the extra point of damage. So those type of things you still want to cast, even if the card itself doesn't impact the pre-combat step, but if it's not going to do anything relevant to the combat, just give your opponent the time to do something like this, and that way you can replay your guy afterwards, since it'll be your best play at that point. Next up is Divert Disaster. So this is another variant that shows up in almost every set. It is the Mana Leak variant. It is blue and 1 for a counter spell. It counters the spell unless the caster pays some amount of mana, in this case 2. And this is something that they've been doing a lot more recently, is because these things get way worse as the game goes on, because the opponents won't be able to spend all of their mana every single turn on every single play, you run into a lot of situations where these things don't counter spells anymore. They just make the opponent tap mana or rot away in your hand. So it gives you a little something extra if the opponent pays. In this case, you get one of those lander tokens. Now, whether or not that has any value to you at the time will depend on the rest of your board state, but there is a landfall deck in green and red. So if you are blue-green or blue-red and you have a lot of the landfall triggers, there's a chance that this one goes up in value for you. When playing around cards like this, there's still the wasted mana potential of if you don't have to cast your spell, you don't do it, or you cast the weaker spell to bait it out. But especially with these, if you can cast a cheaper spell that has a decent board impact, if you just have a cheap, decent card in your hand, like maybe it's a rare, so it has more raw power in it than a normal card at that casting cost. So, like your 2 mana 2/2 with a lot of upside versus your 4 mana 3/3 with some upside. Maybe you run out the 2/2 when they're holding up 2 mana, so that way their counter spell doesn't even counter your thing, and you're still adding to the board. Also, if you're going to cast 2 spells in a turn and use up all of your mana, make sure you cast the more important one first if you're worried about cards like Divert Disaster, because then they won't be able to counter that one and they'll have to counter the weaker of the two, and they were going to get to counter something anyway that turn. But yeah, if you have the commanding board presence and you get your spell countered by this thing, you can just wait. Like, if they don't have anything else to do with their mana, then that mana is wasted, and you're still ahead on board, so you are winning this game. So it's on them to do something first. Let's Divert Disaster. Next up is Ilvoy. However you pronounce the species name, the jellyfish people. Galeblade. That is the one with Flash. So this is 1 blue. So this is one of the other things they could have if they have a null. Because it's only 1 blue. But you'll know pretty soon if they have this one, because they will just flash it out if you don't do anything that would get countered by a null, for example. Or even if you did and they didn't have it, they're going to flash this one out. So 1 blue for a 1/1 flyer. It has flash, and it has 2 sacrifice this creature, draw a card. So one of the biggest things about this creature is that for 3 mana, it can come out of nowhere, block one of your creatures, presumably without trample, and then sacrifice itself to draw a card, thereby negating all of the damage that creature would have dealt to the opponent, and letting them draw a card, and possibly swinging the race back in their favor, or at least giving them another card to look at while saving them a whole lot of damage. So this creature is like a very weird fog. It's also a creature that can come down on your end step and suddenly be attacking in the air for chip damage, which will add up eventually. So it's got a whole lot going on for a 1 mana common. It doesn't have to be vulnerable to early sorcery speed removal, and then it gets to get in for a point of damage or 2, and possibly have the mana back to sacrifice it also if there's nothing else for the opponent to do at the time. So that is something to keep in mind, that they might suddenly have one more blocker or attacker than you thought they would have if they're in blue. Because blue is not usually the color of small flash creatures. Blue is usually the, oh, by the way, this sea serpent just burst out of the water when you weren't expecting it. Although a lot of those ones come into play tap now to remove their surprise value as blockers. Because a lot of the time they were functioning as like blue removal, like kill an attacking creature type of effects because of that. So now you tend not to see them coming into play untapped for that reason, but I guess that means that blue is getting a few more of the cheaper flash creatures that could ambush block because of that. Alright, so that was the Galeblade. Also, there is the Light Jammer, which is an equipment. So, for blue and 1, it's an equipment with flash. Enters the battlefield, it attaches to target creature you control, and that creature gains hexproof until end of turn. And it gives the equipped creature +1/+2, and the equip cost is 3. So, very similar to the +1/+0 and first strike trick, in that it can suddenly win a combat out of nowhere, but also similar to the 1 mana give your creature indestructible, in that this is one of those, it gives the creature hexproof at instant speed in response to a removal spell or other targeted effect that would be problematic for the creature. So It's 2 mana, not 1, so it's harder to leave up 2 mana, but be aware of this thing. Don't just let the opponent untap with protection for their creature if you don't have to, and if the creature is that serious of a threat. After the Light Jammer comes Lost in Space. This is another card that we get a variant on basically every set. This one can target artifacts or creatures. The owner chooses top or bottom of their library and puts the card there, and then you get to surveil one. So just be aware that blue does have the 4 mana. Your creature can wander off in the middle of combat, so it makes double blocks bad. It can make all-out attacks bad if they're suddenly not lethal. Also, depending on the quality of your creatures will determine whether or not this will just kill the creature outright because you'll put it on the bottom, or whether it's just going to be a reprieve from that creature for a little while because you'll put it on top and recast it next turn. Next up is Mental Modulation. Alright, so it costs 1 less during your turn. That's what I could not remember. This is the one. So it taps target artifact or creature, and the caster draws a card. So they can use this offensively to tap a creature for 1 mana and cycle the spell, and then get to attack because you have 1 less blocker. They can also use it defensively by spending 2 mana to tap it at your beginning of combat step, and then you'll still be down that blocker next turn. They can also use it during your end step to tap down a blocker if they need their mana for other things on their turn, to the point where, having 1 extra mana available might make the difference. So that is all the versatility of this card, but at least you will know that you're having 1 less attacker. You might not know that you're having 1 less blocker, though. So be aware of that for trying to keep yourself alive in that regard. Like, if they have to tap down your guys in order to stop you from being able to just attack them for a ton of damage and kill them, then you'll know ahead of time. But if they can get away with letting you attack and tapping down one of your blockers if you don't leave enough things back. But you play around that by playing around anything that would make your creature wander off all of a sudden. Mental Modulation is next, which I asked. There it is. Oh no, that was the one we were just talking about. Mental Modulation. So next up is Scour for Scrap. So this is blue and 3 for an instant. You choose one or both. Search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle, or return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. This is incredibly similar to a card draw spell at instant speed, in that it's not impacting the board at all, but it is giving them something to do with their mana. Tutors, as a general rule, need to be very cheap and limited, because you can't afford to tack 3+ mana onto the casting cost of your best spell, even if it's getting your best spell every time. The fact that this one is an instant doesn't even do all that much, because then you have to draw it, pass the turn with your mana available, and either cast this to go get your artifact anyway, or cast something else because your opponent actually had something, and now this is still a dead card in your hand until you cash it in later. That being said, it's a new set, and there are a lot of artifacts, and this one is a potential 2-for-1 by also getting 1 back from the graveyard. So it's kind of like a worse Fight On, for example, in an artifact-heavy deck. I mean, it costs 1 more mana, but it gets you the creature from your deck instead of your graveyard. Costing 1 more mana, though, is kind of huge for an effect like this, so yeah, you're going to still run into this card. People will still try it out, but it's not that good most of the time. You have to have something pretty dire to tutor for it to be, like, that strong. Our last blue card is Unravel. Should be the counter spell. So 1 and 2 blue. 2 blue and 1. Guess I could have worded that a little less awkwardly. Counter target spell. If the amount of mana spent to cast the spell was less than the spell's mana value, you draw a card. So notably, There is a mechanic in the set called Warp. Warp lets you pay a lower casting cost for the spell, for a permanent, and that permanent will enter the battlefield. It will have its effects on the battlefield for that turn, and then at the end of the turn, it gets exiled, and you can cast it from exile for its actual mana cost from that point forward. So, notably, the way Magic works, and this is something that trips up a lot of newer players, especially, the casting cost does not change. The mana value of a spell is its printed mana value. The only way it ever changes is if there is an X in the casting cost while it is on the stack. That is the only variable that can ever change what the actual mana value of the spell is. Every other spell's mana value is 100% what it says in the top right corner, regardless of how much mana was spent to cast it. So it doesn't just work with Warp. If you have, like, your artifact spells cost one less to cast, and you play an artifact spell, and it gets countered by Unravel, because you spent one less mana to cast it, they get to draw a card. So it works on anything where the amount of mana spent is less than the numbers up in the top right corner. It's a counterspell. You play around it the same way you play around other counterspells. It is in cancel mana range. You know, anything that costs 3+, it's very difficult to hold up that mana every turn without having other things to do, flash creatures, card draw spells, bounce spells, and as we've seen, there's not a ton in blue to work with, where leaving up 3 mana for Unravel, and then they don't do anything because they're ahead on board and they don't have to, is not going to be pretty devastating for you. So make sure your Unravel is either available to you when you are winning, or that you cast it basically on the first opportunity. Like, don't let them resolve anything if this is all you have to work with, because you're going to fall further and further behind every turn that you don't use it, and you really want to hope to draw something else you can cast. So you don't want to have up 3 mana in addition to whatever you drew on subsequent turns, as the flip side of opponents properly playing around counter spells. Alright, that moves us into black. So our first black card is part of a mega cycle, which means that the other cards in the cycle do not appear in the same set as it. This is Archenemy's Charm. It goes along with Archmage's Charm and Archdruid's Charm. It costs 3 mana of its appropriate color, in this case black. It is an instant, and you have 3 modes to choose from. You can exile target creature or planeswalker. You can return 1 or 2 target creature and or planeswalker cards from your graveyard to your hand. Or you can put 2/1/1 counters on target creature you control, and it gains lifelink until end of turn. This one is very difficult to cast if you are not incredibly heavy black. There are the lander tokens, so a deck that's running a lot of them and a lot of green fixing in a green-black deck can probably pull this one off, but there's not any real fixing in the other colors. So, Archenemy's Charm is going to be for incredibly heavy black decks and still kind of hard to cast sometimes. Mono black decks, where it's just a 3 mana removal spell or creature pump, or double raise dead. Or in black-green, where the green is providing a lot of the fixing for the charm, so that way you can cast it reasonably over the course of a game. As a removal spell, it's very straightforward. All removal spells that don't have any restrictions on them are very straightforward. Just be aware what the casting cost is, so you know if your opponent can vaporize your creature in the middle of anything. The double raise dead is not that impressive. Fight on for triple black. Also of note, there is only 1 planeswalker in this set. We're back to that. We've had a set or two where there have been like 2 planeswalkers, but they're back to the 1 planeswalker per set. And we kind of traded off in that there were no planeswalkers in Final Fantasy, I'm still kind of mad about that on Gilgamesh's behalf. Definitely should have been a Gideon style planeswalker that turns into a creature, but that's an aside that we don't really need. The third mode, 2/1/1 counters and lifelink, can not only win combat randomly, but can also really turn a race in the favor of the caster of Arch Enemy's Charm. Yes, killing the creature is probably the best mode, and the 2-for-1 value on getting two things back is incredibly strong, but don't ignore that third one. That third one is a real problem if it actually kills your guy and gains them a ton of life, or just gains them a ton of life in a tight race, where now they're not dying in the same amount of turns you thought they were. So be aware of this one. Obviously, it's pretty telegraphed that they have it if they have a ton of black mana available to them. And this is one of the main reasons to have a ton of black mana available to you, is the raw power that this thing represents. Yeah, Murder, or Hero's Downfall, rather. And it exiles, too. Like I said, there's a slightly above average amount of graveyard recursion in this set. So exiling the creature is super relevant. Getting back two things is a problem, but yeah, that +2/+2, which is permanent. Lifelink is until end of turn, but the two counters stay with the creature, can really swing a race back in the opponent's favor. Possibly more so than killing one random creature will. But especially if it gets to trade the trick for the creature instead of the creature for the creature, and gain them a ton of life and leave them with a body on board now that they weren't supposed to have. Alright, next up is Dark Endurance. So this spell costs one less to cast if it targets a blocking creature. This is the black version of the card that we keep seeing, where the creature doesn't die. It either gains indestructible or it dies and then comes back, depending on which version of the card you're looking at. This one also gives +2 power. So for 1 mana, it can give a blocker +2 power and indestructible until end of turn. Or for 2 mana, it can give an attacking creature or just a creature that's standing around not doing anything at the time that you tried to reach out and kill. So yeah, so far, White has had a 1 mana trick that can save a dude. Blue has had a 2 mana trick that can save a dude, and now Black has a usually 2 mana, but sometimes 1 mana if it's blocking, trick that can save a dude. Seriously, if your opponent casts something really scary and they're tapped out, kill the thing there. It's really important nowadays. Every color so far, we're 3 for 3, and I believe green has one also. So it's only red that does not have a way to instant speed save a creature from removal. After Dark Endurance, Depressurize. So this is one of the weirder removal spells I have ever seen. It's 1 in a black for an instant. Target creature gets -3/-0 until end of turn. Then, if that creature has power 0 or less, destroy it. So this can kill a small creature, provided your opponent can't pump its power in response to save it. But it also wins combat a lot of the time by making their creature so small that it doesn't get to kill your guy, and now you just get to eat their creature in combat instead of trading with it. It's weird, like I said, because it's only a combat trick if -3 doesn't get the creature's power to 0. So in that regard, it's just kind of bad as a removal spell. It does kill little creatures, which is not terrible. Very similar to something like Vane's Treachery, where -2/-2 will kill a lot of the early creatures. So it's still killing most of those creatures, unless your opponent has a pump spell, in which case they don't lose their guy, and they still get to probably deal combat damage to you or to the creature that they're attacking into or blocking or whatever. So this one's just a tiny bit worse in a lot of cases than things like that. But it's not unplayable because of that. But it is very weird.
It's like, you're about to get sucked into this black hole, so you better be able to hold on real tight, and if you don't have the strength for that, you're going out the airlock and into the void. Right next to it is our next instant speed card. It is Dubious Delicacy. This is one of the funniest ones in the set. So it is 2 and a black for an artifact food. It has flash, which is what gets us onto this list. When this artifact enters, up to one target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. It also has 2-tap, sacrifice this artifact to gain 3 life like a normal food, or 2-tap, sacrifice this artifact, target opponent loses 3 life. So this is one of those alien food situations where it's like they can eat it just fine and it's tasty, but their guests look at it and go, "Oh, wow, you are actually eating that. That is horrifying, and I don't think my body could handle that." That is what this trope is in card form. So, 3 mana for -3/-3, and then it sticks around both as an artifact to count towards your things that care about the number of artifacts. And I'm looking at Embrace Oblivion over there that, as an additional cost to cast, sacrifice an artifact or creature. It's your Bone Splinters variant. It can kill spacecrafts in addition to creatures. So it's fodder for things like that, and there are plenty of other cards in black especially that want you to be able to sacrifice creatures or artifacts because they have that warp mechanic where, or I'm sorry, not the warp mechanic, the other one, where if something, void, if something died or if something was warped this turn and it wasn't a land, you get to do something. So this is an artifact that is fodder for those effects, or that can trigger those effects by sacrificing itself after it has been used to kill a creature. So this one plays a lot more like a card like Vane's Treachery. It costs a little more, but it has other options instead of the sacrifice something to give -6/-6. So it can kill medium-sized creatures on its own still, and then it can give you the ability to close out a game by making the opponent lose 3 life, or save you by gaining 3 life, and triggering like all of your void cards in the meantime. That's Dubious Delicacy. Next up is Gravkill. There it is. Black and 3, exile target creature or spacecraft. In case you're wondering, similar to vehicles, spacecraft's primary function is to eventually become a creature. So black is allowed to kill it even though black is not normally allowed to kill artifacts. It has to very specifically kill that subset of artifacts in order to not break the color pie, but yes, it can kill artifacts if the artifact's primary function is to be a creature. But it has to call them out by that type in order to work. Otherwise, it has to wait until the artifact becomes a creature all on its own in order to kill it. But yeah, this is your 4 mana, kill anything, instant speed removal spell. Notably, it is 4 mana, so there's not an overkill type effect in this set that only costs 3, and straight up kills a creature no matter what. So this is your 4 mana instant speed kill anything card in the set. After Gravkill comes Vote Out. About to get proven wrong, aren't I? Is Vote Out 3 mana? No, Vote Out is 4 mana, but it can be convoked. So technically, if you want to tap your creatures, you can kill a thing for 3 or less mana. This one just destroys target creature. So, Convoke means that you can tap an untapped creature you control to help pay for it. Notably, a black creature can tap for the black portion of the casting cost, and your other creatures, whether or not they're black, can pay for the 3. So, technically, this is one that your opponent... Oh, wait, this is a sorcery. Why did I think this was an instant? My apologies. Sorry, Vote Out. You've been voted out of this conversation. I misread that as an instant. Alright. So, we skip Vote Out because it's not actually on the list. You don't have to... You do have to worry about it, but it's going to be something your opponent has to cast at sorcery speed. Something else they have to cast at sorcery speed, but does make the list, is 0-point Ballad. So, this costs black and X. It destroys all creatures with toughness X or less, and the caster loses X life. If X is 6 or more, return a creature card put into a graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. So, one of the most notable things about this spell is, unlike other Wrath effects, trying to wait for the opponent to commit one more creature to the board is a lot less viable if you're going to be taking damage. Because you actually have to be able to survive casting 0-point Ballad in order for this to work. That being said, it kills creatures. You can sculpt what it kills, so if you have a creature with toughness greater than X, it just lives. Notably, this does not give -X to creatures, or -0/-X, since it cares about toughness only. It has to be X is their toughness, or it does nothing to kill them. So pump spells will save creatures and not leave them vulnerable to getting into combat or something later on. Like, if you pay 5 and your opponent gives their 5 toughness creature +2/+2, they now have an X7 in play, and nothing bad happened to it at all from this card. So do keep that in mind when deciding what X is going to be and what you're going to be able to kill, but past that, it's going to destroy everything X or less toughness, so you can sculpt it so that your big creatures survive. So this thing is actually really potent in like a black-green deck especially, where you can choose numbers where your guys will survive and theirs won't, for the most part. And if X happens to be 6 or more, you also get back one of the things that you killed. So if you have a 7 toughness creature in play and you manage to kill everything else, and you're down 6 life, but now you have a 7 toughness creature, which presumably has like 5+ power at that point, and you get back something else that was killed, you're probably doing great. So, as far as playing around this one goes, lowering their life total quickly actually makes it harder to cast this spell for full value. So, your creatures are always safe from this spell if their toughness is higher than the amount of life plus mana your opponent can pay. So just keep that in mind. Like, a mana-screwed opponent that gets up to 5 mana with the White Wrath is going to still be able to cast the White Wrath. A mana-screwed opponent that gets up to 5 mana for this one might not be able to kill the things that they need to kill, and X will not be 6 or more in that scenario, because X is going to be like 4 at that point. They won't be able to get back a creature, they might not be able to kill everything that you have, and they're going to lose their board state most likely too, because they haven't been able to play spells up until this point. So yeah, 0-point Ballad is not a Wrath in the traditional sense, but because it's sculptable, it can actually be more devastating in the right circumstances. Casting this for black and 2 and killing all of your opponent's X2s while you have like 1 or 2, 3 toughness creatures is probably going to be incredibly devastating in almost every scenario. So, just be aware of this card if you have a lot of low toughness creatures and they have a lot of bigger creatures. This one's going to get you real bad, because it's going to Garruk's Wake you instead of wrathing the board. Sorry, my voice is going a little bit. Alright, that brings us to red. So first up for red is Bombard. It is red and 2, deal 4 damage to target creature. Very straightforward, red removal spell. Kills most things at around the same casting cost. So, just treat it like other removal spells. After that one comes Cut Propulsion. Oh, it's literally right next to it. Just gonna scroll right past it. Target creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. If that creature has flying, it deals twice that much damage to itself instead. So, cut propulsion allows you to kill a creature that has power greater than its toughness, or if it's a flying creature, power or toughness that is um, less than less than double its power. I was gonna go for a bit more awkward way of explaining it. It just sounds terrible. So yeah. So if they have a 2/4 flyer, this can kill the 2/4 flyer because it will deal 4 damage to itself. Um, Again, it's just a removal spell. The easiest way to play around this one is to have a bunch of non-flyers that have more toughness than power, because then this thing does nothing without another creature getting involved or some other damage source adding on to it, and at that point they're 2-for-1ing themselves. But you won't always have control of that, and Wizards really likes its square stats for a lot of things, so because it's easier to parse on board when the power and the toughness are equal. So this should still kill a lot of things, but it does not kill everything. And it is very dependent on the creature's stats for its ability to kill stuff. Notably, though, there are a few things that boost power but not toughness. So cut propulsion might be able to kill something because the opponent went for a power boost on their creature, even if it normally couldn't. So also keep that in mind, that boosting your creature's power might suddenly make it vulnerable to this thing, where it wasn't before. So if your opponent keeps getting priority on Arena with 3 mana available, and they're not casting anything, and you have like a large toughness non-flying creature that could not kill itself, just be aware that if you suddenly pumped its power too much, it might kill itself. And they might be like, finally, I got to get this dead card out of my hand. Playing in paper, it's kind of harder to tell that this could be the thing, but I mean, if you're playing around cards like Bombard, you're probably playing around cut propulsions too, except in that exact scenario, so. Next up is Drill 2 Deep. So this is 1 in a red for an instant. So this is a weird one. The first mode is what makes it weird. The second mode is Destroy Target Artifact. So it's already a Shatter in a set with tons of artifacts. So you're going to run into this thing anyway. This is main deckable in this set because there are so many spacecraft in this set, and a lot of them have spell-like abilities when they come in to make up for the fact that they are not creatures until you've tapped a bunch of your other things. But there's still going to be a ton of artifacts running around, so this thing is probably main deckable. Where it gets really weird is the other ability. Put 5 charge counters on target spacecraft or planet you control. So, spacecrafts and planets that use the station mechanic get charge counters to determine whether or not they meet the thresholds. So, our galvanizing saw ship over here, stationing it with 3 total power worth of creatures gives it 3 charge counters, which then allows it to become its creature form. So, putting 5 counters on a spacecraft or planet you control might turn it from a non-artifact creature into an artifact creature. So, this is very important to be aware of. Your opponent's non-creature artifact can suddenly get up and start fighting with the rest of them. So, if you're attacking, they might suddenly have a blocker that was on board the entire time but did not have stats up until this point. So that is something to keep in mind. Like I said, it's a weird one. This is going to catch a lot of people off guard. They are not going to be thinking, oh, they can instant speed turn this spaceship into its creature mode. And this is the card that's going to get them out of nowhere. Let's see. Drill 2 Deep. Our next one is Full Bore. 1 red, instant, target creature you control gets +3/+2 until end of turn. If that creature was cast for its warp cost, it gains trample and haste until end of turn. So notably, some creatures with warp do have haste, with the idea that you will get to attack with them once and then they will wander off until later on when you can cast them for their warp cost. This is most common in red because it's a ball lightning type effect, where the creature comes into play, attacks that turn, and then wanders off. In this case, though, it's wandering off to a place where you can cast it again later on. but it still kind of feels like that ball lightning type effect. So this is an instant, but if the warped creature does not itself have haste, then this thing will have to be cast at sorcery speed in order for it to attack. If it has haste, though, just keep in mind that not only can they give it +3 power for 1 mana, they can also give it trample. 1 mana +3 power and trample is a lot of damage out of nowhere. Like, your chump blockers suddenly look very anemic when they only soak up 1 to 2 points of damage from something with like 5+ power and trample. Especially if the game has gone on any amount of time. So just be aware of this one. Also, it still gives +3/+2. It's not quite Giant Growth. Giant Growth wins every combat. +3 toughness and +3 power for 1 mana make it nearly impossible to block properly. And for 1 mana, it's almost always available without interfering with anything else that you're doing. This one is slightly weaker than that, but it does still give toughness, so just be aware of that. It's not going to gain trample if it's not a warped creature, though, so you don't have to worry about that as much. But they can still save their creature with 2 extra toughness, and they can kill more of your blockers if you double block or triple block with the +3 power than you might have been expecting. So just keep that in mind for red, that they have this trick, even if they're not going to be able to give trample. And also, especially keep this in mind if the creature was warped and they can give it trample. Because if the creature is big enough, that's going to hit you for a lot of damage out of nowhere. Alright, next up is Invasive Maneuvers. Wonderful name. So, 1 in a red, Invasive Maneuvers deals 3 damage to target creature. It deals 5 damage instead if you control a spacecraft. So this is the idea of, instead of trying to avoid the opponent, you are going to slam into them with your spaceship. So instead of evasive, it's invasive maneuvers. So 1 in a red, deal 3 damage to a creature is already like a fine rate. Being able to deal 5 damage to a creature, though, is a very efficient creature-based burn spell for red to get. Usually when red gets a 1 in a red, deal 5 damage, it's limited in some way. In this case, you have to have the spaceship in play. Notably, you do have to have it in play while the spell is resolving, so be a little careful about that if you're going for the 5 damage, and you only have the 1 spaceship in play. If your opponent has any instant speed way to kill your spaceship or make it wander off, then you will suddenly only be dealing 3 points of damage, so keep that one in mind. Also, keep that in mind when you're playing against it if your opponent only has 1 ship, and you can suddenly get rid of it. Don't let your creature die when you can 2-for-1 them instead, by getting rid of their spaceship and making their thing not kill your guy. Alright, after invasive maneuvers comes lithobreaking, down here into the L's. So, 2 in a red, create a lander token, then you may sacrifice an artifact. When you do, lithobreaking deals 2 damage to each creature. So, notably, this is a modal spell. It has 3 modes. The first one is 2 in a red, make a lander token, which you can then spend 2 mana later on and sacrifice in order to get a land out of your deck, and it will trigger all of your artifacts coming into play, and then later on all of your non-land permanents leaving play type effects. The second mode is red and 2, deal 2 damage to each creature, because you can sacrifice the lander token to itself, and it makes the lander token first. And the third mode is, you get the lander token, and then you sacrifice one of your other artifacts that you don't actually care about because you need the lander token for whatever reason, or the other artifact has a death trigger or something, and get to deal 2 damage to all creatures, like maybe you're sacrificing a 2 toughness artifact creature, like one of the robot tokens. So, those are the 3 modes on this spell. The ones that deal 2 damage to all creatures are what get it on this list, because it is a wrath if it kills all 2 toughness creatures. As we've proven, cheap creatures or low toughness creatures dying is still a wrath if all of yours suddenly wander off and all of your opponents are still alive. It's worse for you than a wrath. So you do have to be aware of this thing, and what creatures you have that are vulnerable to it. and whether or not you're deploying another creature that's vulnerable to it, if you don't have to. And it's not going to help as much on board. Alright, next up is Rig for War. Scroll through all of these. Rig for War. Red and 1, target creature gets +3/+0 and gains first strike and reach until end of turn. So this is another one that shows up in almost every set, is the power plus first strike red trick. And it usually does something else also, or costs 1 less and gives a smaller power boost. Sometimes also still doing something else, like scrying 1, for example. This one is going to let red win most combats. +3 power and first strike is a lot like +3 power and +3 toughness, in that your creature is going to live way more often than normal. So +3 power and first strike also going to let it live way more often than normal. But notably, this lets you ambush a flying creature by giving your thing reach. So this is also a defensive trick if it needs to be. So keep that one in mind if you're winning with flyers in the air. Your opponent is holding back a non-flying creature. This might be the trick that they have, and you might be losing your guy. So keep that in mind. You might be able to attack profitably still, or at least not lose your best guy to this trick. Very similar to playing around the kill a tapped creature and gain life. If you can make them kill a worse creature with this, because you're not leaving your best guy vulnerable, then they can't just sit back on their mana. The downside to this one, though, is that if they do sit back on their mana, they might have a way to push through lethal damage later on by going wide around you and suddenly having one of their creatures gain 3 power. So just be aware of that one also. Like, if they're not blocking, but they're still attacking, then they might use this offensively, where they, like other spells, they only have the option to use them defensively. Alright, after Rig for War comes Ruinous Rampage. So, because there are so many artifacts in this set, normally I would skip a card like this if there weren't a lot of artifacts in this set. But there are a lot of artifacts, and a lot of them are creatures, or can become creatures. So it is very relevant that this thing can kill artifacts. So it has 2 modes, and you choose one for 1 and 2 red. It deals 3 damage to each opponent, or it exiles all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. So this can kill robot tokens, lander tokens, and all cheap artifacts. So creatures, regular old artifacts, and spaceships that cost 3 or less can all get wiped away by this thing. So, and it has the ability to just dome the opponent for 3 if that's not good enough. So you might actually run into this thing, even in best of 1. Like, somebody might not have great removal, and they might not have a ton of cheap artifacts specifically, so they might be running this just to kill a bunch of cheap artifact creatures and or spaceships. And as a secondary mode, they can just dome the opponent for 3 mana. So that's not the worst fail case if you don't have anything better to work with. And the last card, and this one's kind of annoying, is Terminal Velocity, which for some reason refuses to load on this page. I tried it 3 different times, and it did not load. Oh no, did I accidentally close? Oh, there it is. I was going to say, did I accidentally close out the thing? Because I had it pulled up. So this is Terminal Velocity. You may put an artifact or creature card from your hand onto the battlefield for 6 mana at sorcery speed. That permanent gains haste, and when this permanent leaves the battlefield, it deals damage equal to its mana value to each creature. And, at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice this permanent. So, this is a 6 mana sneak attack, but when the creature leaves the battlefield, it deals damage equal to its mana value to each creature in play. So, this can be used to put a giant thing onto the battlefield and then kill everything, or a smaller creature onto the battlefield and kill all of the little creatures. Notably, it can still attack because this is a when it leaves the battlefield trigger. So it can attack, and it doesn't care if it gets blocked or not. Now, obviously, the opponents will probably block it with whatever they have, but it doesn't matter. If it had like, if it can get through, it will deal the damage, and if it can't get through, it's like, okay, you killed it, and it's still going to blow up and kill everything. So, regardless of what situation they find themselves in, it's going to explode and it's going to kill all the things that it's going to kill. So yeah, it is a red 6-mana Wrath that requires you to have a high power creature in play, or a low power creature in play if you have a lot of high toughness creatures and your opponent doesn't. Alright, that brings us to green. So the first one is Biosynthetic Burst. So 1 in a green, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains reach, trample, and indestructible until end of turn. Untap it. This is green's contribution to the 1 or 2 mana trick that saves your creature by giving it indestructible. It also untaps it and gives it a +1/+1 counter, so it can now suddenly block creatures that it wasn't able to before. It's back on defense on subsequent turns. Well, at least subsequent turn. Like, if you're attacking with this thing and the opponent goes for a block and then you cast this, well, now your creature is also back to block in addition to not dying in the middle of combat, and probably killing their creature even if their creature was slightly bigger. Yeah, this is a particularly brutal one. Fortunately, it only leaves behind 1 +1/+1 counter, but that's still something, so I'm still going to feel gotten by this card when my opponent casts it. But yeah, just be aware of this. Not only can it save a creature from removal, it can also be a surprise blocker out of nowhere. Also, it gives trample for good measure, so if the creature was huge and getting chump blocked, there is in fact a, oh, by the way, this creature has trample combat trick in the set while we're at it. Which is certainly not nothing, but it might be the one of the less problematic aspects of the card. The 1/1 counter and the indestructible out of nowhere are the worst parts for the opponent, but untapping it and giving it reach also not great, and trample randomly will win the game some amount of the time. Alright, next up is Close Encounter. So, 1 in a green, as an additional cost to cast the spell, choose a creature you control or a warped creature you own in exile. Close Encounter deals damage equal to the power of the chosen creature or card to target creature. So, notably, Close Encounter is the source of the damage, so it does not work with Death Touch creatures. So, just keep that in mind. It will still obviously deal the creature's power in damage to the targeted creature, but things like Death Touch, Lifelink, and in older sets, Infect and whatnot don't actually matter for this effect. It's not a fight and it's not a punch. It is the Close Encounters is the source of the damage. Right next to it is Diplomatic Relations. Target creature you control, or, well, target creature gets +1/+0 and gains vigilance until end of turn. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature. Wait a minute. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains vigilance until end of turn. It deals damage. Huh. That's interesting. I did not realize that. You can make one of your opponent's creatures punch one of their other creatures. Hang on a second. I need to check something real quick. Because the FAQ is up. Art cards, pre-release guide. Where is the standard deck? Wait, is it not available yet? There's usually a rules document that gets released when the full set goes live. Huh. Let's try this one. Tokens, art cards, pre-release guide. Yeah, there's usually a a rules FAQ document that goes live when the rest of the set is put up. I want to check that just to make sure that that doesn't have any errata on it or anything. Because that is wild. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains vigilance until end of turn. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. It's not even to another. You can make a creature punch itself. What? There has to be something on this card. I will wait. I would double check the thing here. Hang on. Let's see if although if the official rules document isn't up, then Scryfall isn't going to have it. What is the name of the card again? Diplomatic Relations. Alright. Diplomatic. Because there's not going to be... Not even... They have the other cards up, right? What is going on? Did it get added today and they haven't updated yet? Maybe that's it. It got added today and they haven't updated yet. That is wild. Yeah, I would double check with the rules document once it goes live, because this is not correct. This is a massive color pie break for green if it works this way. It should be target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains vigilance until end of turn. Deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. Because right now, how this is worded is, you can give your opponent's creature +1 power and then have it punch itself in the face. This is just straight up a green kill spell for anything that has toughness less than its power, less than or equal to its power +1. And green does not get that at all. So yeah, I would double check that. This might be one of those situations where there's an error in the card printing, and there will be a errata for this card. But right now, as it works, that is insane, and there is no playing around this thing. There's no playing around removal anyway, other than to have interaction for the original target for the fight. But since your thing might be punching itself in the face, that there's no real way to save it. Other than by giving it more toughness than power from some source. Alright. So, yeah. My brain auto-corrected to what I would expect it to be when I first read this card. So, now that I'm actually reading it here, that is wild. I would expect there to be some sort of errata on this one, but we're going to go ahead to the next card because there's no current thing, but I would definitely double check that before you go to the pre-release, because that seems very, very wrong. Our next card is Seed Ship Impact. Agrarian, no. Impact. So this is 1 in a green, destroy target artifact or enchantment. If its mana value was 2 or less, create a lander token. So, as I said, there are plenty of artifacts in this set that are also creatures, or that can become creatures, and just have powerful effects in general. Like, some of the starships have very powerful statics once you've activated them enough. So, being able to kill one of those is already going to be important. So, you should expect to see Seed Ship Impact have main deck play a lot of the time. And the fact that it will give you a lander token if you kill something smaller is also helpful, because, casting cost does not always indicate power level. Some things are higher power level because of their low casting cost relative to what they're doing, so you might actually be able to get the lander token out of this while getting a powerful artifact or enchantment off the table. It's removal. Just be aware that it's your artifacts and enchantments that are vulnerable to this one, and not necessarily your other creatures, but I'm still kind of reeling from diplomatic relations. Alright, we go into the gold cards, and I'm going to be perfectly honest. This might be one of the dumbest cards I have ever seen for limited purposes. There are a lot of cards in the history of Magic that are just incredibly powerful in their limited environments where if you cast them, you almost always win the game. I think this is going to be that card for this set. If this set is not incredibly fast, and you can reliably live to 7 mana, this thing is impossibly dumb. So, how it works is, it's 3, black, black, red, red, it's a sorcery. You choose odd or even. For the purposes of Magic the Gathering, 0 is considered even. Sorry, mathematicians. That's just how Magic is. You destroy each creature whose mana value is the chosen quality. So if you choose odd, every 1-drop, 3-drop, 5-drop creature in play explodes. All of the 0s, the 2s, the 4s, etc. live. Then, gain control of all creatures that are still in play until end of turn. Untap them, they gain haste until end of turn. Notably, if a creature gets saved from this effect by gaining indestructible, for example, you will still get to steal it. It does not give you control over creatures of the quality of mana value not chosen. It gives you control of all creatures that are still in play. So indestructible creatures also get grabbed. So if it's better for you to kill all the even mana value creatures, but one of the even mana value creatures your opponent has is indestructible, not only is it still not back to block, it is part of the new offensive that is coming at their face. I don't know what a board state looks like that this doesn't completely wreck it for any player that was on the receiving end of it, and normally will kill them, almost regardless of life total. Like, if all of the even or all of the odd creatures' total powers add up to your opponent's life total or greater, this just wins the game on the spot. If you have a bunch of even mana value creatures and they have almost none, you get to choose even and kill most of their creatures and a couple of yours, steal what creatures they have left, and punch them in the face. The same is true if you have mostly odd creatures and they don't. So, the way this works is if you don't have the win on the spot, you get to figure out what is the worst thing for your opponent to lose and do that. It is going to be very difficult for both you and your opponent to have creatures of the appropriate qualities in play where stealing them does not win you the game, but choosing them to die doesn't also disrupt the opponent's game plan more than it disrupts yours. See what I'm saying here? Like, this thing is absolutely absurd. This is worse than a card like Doom Blast for the opponent. And Doom Blast is one of the most powerful cards in a limited environment as far as a Wrath effect goes. Like, it kills everything except your best creature. Yeah, this is that, except it kills everything except your best creatures and steals your opponents. If the format is not slow enough, though, this thing probably won't matter, because getting to 7 mana to win the game is great. Like, you need it to win you the game now, because you're dying the entire time. So maybe this thing won't be that bad, but as far as the wording goes on it, it is one of the most absurd Magic cards I have ever seen. Alright, we have one more Wrath to get to, and it is in fact a Wrath, because it is Singularity Rupture. So for 3 blue, black, black, destroy all creatures, then any number of target players each mill half their library rounded down. So this is a Wrath that can also help deck your opponent. It can also put a ton of cards into your graveyard if you need that, and you can survive having half your deck milled, because it does let you target yourself. Also of note, if your opponent has a Graveyard Matters deck, you don't have to mill anybody. Also, as a tiny subnote, which should not come up in the limited environment for this format because there's no way to give a player hexproof or shroud or protection. If this thing has targets and all targets become invalid, it will cancel out the spell entirely. When a spell has one or more targets and all targets are invalid, the spell has no effect and goes to the graveyard. It's not even technically countered. It's countered by the rules, not by a spell or ability, so it doesn't even count as being countered for the purposes of card effects. It used to be countered by the rules of the game, which is why you will see older cards that say can't be countered by spells or abilities, because it can still be countered by rules, and they needed to have that in the old wording. But yeah, now the spell just fails to resolve in its entirety. It doesn't come up in Limited, but I feel like I should mention that because it's one of those weird things. I don't think there's anything that can give you protection or hexproof, but if I'm forgetting something and that's in this set, that's something to be aware of, but it has to be able to do it at instant speed in order to counter the effect, because if you're not a valid target for it to begin with, and this thing has up to X targets, then you just don't choose any targets for it and the spell will resolve normally, because it didn't have any targets to become invalid at that point. And seeing as I went over all of the instance and source, instance flash spells and whatnot, and I don't remember seeing that effect, I'm just double checking to make sure I didn't miss an actual instant up here. I don't think I did. Most of the gold cards are creatures or some other type of permanent. There are a few sorceries. Okay, just triple checking for my own state of mind. And then there were no flash artifacts either, and no mass removal ones. Just triple checking, because that should bring us to the special guests. So there are 2 instant speed special guest cards that we need to go over. The first one is Darkness. This is a reprint of the card from Legends. It is a black fog. It prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. So, fog effects generally are very bad in Limited, but that will not stop people from trying, especially newer players or as sideboard tech against decks that really win by winning races and smashing face in order to get there. Now, granted, you might think, well, that's most decks. Why are we not playing fog effects? Because you are spending an entire card to not only not take combat damage, but also to not deal it back to the opponent's cards. So it might save you from a bunch of damage, and that's cool and all, but it will not let you eat your opponent's creatures or anything. So you are going down a card to essentially gain a bunch of life and maybe tap the creatures, but your opponent is getting to decide which creatures are getting tapped at that point. So if they're being careful to not die in a close race, they're probably not going to get blown out by Darkness. So you're only really going to get the players that are super aggressive and not playing around it at all. Now, that being said, it is a special guest card, and it does cost a single black mana to use. So that combination means that its ambush factor is a lot higher, but it is just a fog effect. So be aware of it. If your opponent is in black and they're being very reckless with their attacks, they might have fog as their way to not die. Or they might just have a handful of removal and kill your creatures and not take damage on the crackback. The other card is Warping Whale. So this is a modal spell with 3 different modes. You can exile a target creature with power or toughness 1 or less. You can counter a sorcery spell, or you can create a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature token. Notably, this spell costs 1 generic and 1 colorless mana specifically. For those of you who might be newer to the game, you might not have seen the colorless mana symbol because it doesn't come up as often. But it cannot be cast with anything that is not colorless mana specifically. So there is a special bonus sheet of lands from various Magic sets, and multiple cards on that bonus sheet are capable of producing colorless mana. There is also, I think there's 1 or 2. Yeah, Secluded Starforge can tap for colorless. There aren't many. Oh, there's 1. There is actually 1 regular, naturally appearing land where you get to choose to add colorless, because this one only taps for 1 mana of any color, not any type. So, actually, I'm kind of sad it doesn't tap for mana of any type because they have Warping Wail on the bonus sheet. So yeah, Warping Wail is actually kind of difficult to cast in this format, bordering on impossible for some decks. So, if they have colorless lands, you have to be aware of it, but its modes are make a 1/1 that might be able to attack or block, counter a sorcery, which can be huge if your sorcery is a wrath or a creature removal spell or something, and being able to kill creatures with exactly 1 power or exactly 1 toughness. So yeah, those are all of the instance spells with flash and wrath effects in this set. I hope this helps you. I know it helps me. Just knowing that the opponent needs 4 mana if they don't have a rare that costs triple black in order to kill my creature with a black removal spell, if it has more than 3 toughness, or more than 3 power rather. More than 3 toughness and more than 3 power, actually. When you know what your opponent needs to have and at what mana costs in order to be able to interact with your spells, you know when it's safe to do certain things and when it isn't. So it's very important to know all of these cards ahead of time. Like I said, I do feel like once you have played with the set for a couple weeks, or, once you've played, like, multiple events, if you're playing in paper, you really do start to get a feel for what all of the combat tricks are. But if you know enough of them ahead of time, you don't get caught by them. And then you get to win those games instead of having it be the learning experience where it's like, okay, now I know there's a Wrath in blue-black and in white. Now that I've seen both of them, it's like, no, now you've seen both of them. You know that they exist. You know that if your opponent is splashing blue in their black-green deck, it might be for the Wrath, for example. So just knowing what the opponents can do that can really disrupt your game plan. Obviously, every single card in this set has game text, and, playing a thing at sorcery speed because it's required and it kills your guy is still kind of bad for you, or playing a haste creature that you weren't prepared for because now they have an extra attacker. There's a lot of stuff that if you don't know about in the set can ambush you still, but these are the ones that can ambush you at the last possible second where everything looks fine and you think you've got it. So just be aware of those cards, and you're going to win a few more games than you would in the early sessions of the set before you get to know all these cards from playing against them and with them. So I hope this helps you. Like I said, it always helps me. So I do believe in this as a means to make you slightly better and help you win a few more packs at the pre-release. Let me know if this helps you. I would appreciate it greatly. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.